Okay, so good evening, everyone. I, Indrani Sen, on behalf of the Society for Data Science, BIT Mesra, welcomes you all for this session. I've joined with my fellow colleagues, Kanak, Rohit, and Kajal. So today in our session, we have Dr. Chris, who is the lead developer of the SciML Open Source Software ecosystem and the Pumas-AI Inc. pharmacometrics platform. His research and software is focused on scientific AI and scientific machine learning, the integration of domain models with machine learning. Dr. Chris is at the cutting edge of mathematical methods for scientific simulation. He is the lead developer of the DifferentialEquations.jl solver suite along with other Julia packages, earning him the inaugural Julia Community Prize and front page features in tech community sites. We are hoping he will fuel our curiosity and tell us a lot about his research. Now we would hand over to Dr. Chris.
Yeah, hello. Let me. I am so sorry about that. I just accidentally hit the exit when clicking share.
Oh yeah, no problem, sir.
Yep. All right, so everyone sees my screen here?
Yeah, sir, we can see.
Yep. So, hello. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Chris Rackauckas. I'm an applied math instructor at MIT and the director of scientific research at Pumas-AI. So what I'm going to talk about today is scientific machine learning, right? So it's this kind of new discipline that's been popping up, which in a nutshell, what it lets you do is it lets you get more predictive machine learning with less data. And I want to really explain why heuristically that would be true, and then how do you do it, and what are some of the results that people have gotten in this field. So the general outline here is that, I'm going to introduce scientific machine learning, and then I'm going to dig into a few applications. I'm going to specifically look into battery engineering and climate scenarios, though there are a lot of others that we could talk about in its context. After kind of explaining a bit about those applications, I'm going to move over to kind of describing how, not going too deep, but kind of describing how scientific machine learning is a bit more than machine learning, right? So that there are some issues where if you're to just try to use a standard machine learning problem on a scientific problem, you don't necessarily solve the problem all the way. You really need new tools to be able to handle these kinds of issues. And then what I'm going to end with is showcasing the tools in the SciML ecosystem and how they solve the problems that I described here. So scientific machine learning as a whole is this kind of model-based data-efficient version of machine learning. And really what it's trying to do at a high level is mix models with data, right? So you're basically like, these models, like, a biological model, right? So when you go to a biology class and they tell you something about the canonical Wnt signaling pathway, right? A canonical Wnt signaling pathway is something that is a lot of knowledge, right? Like it's a lot of data, and every single undergraduate who goes through their courses, does a little thing inside of a laboratory for their course, getting more data, proving that thing is true, right? So those models are essentially a source of big data if you could use them in machine learning. Right. So if you could interpret these kinds of chemical reaction systems or these other types of physical laws, these are all a source of big data that you can mix with this big experimental data, and then try to build a machine learning system that is more efficient than if you just use data alone, right? So the core here is we want to use physical laws, these scientific models, mathematical models, all of these things together with machine learning. And that is how we get something that can have better prediction power, right? Because the general idea here is that you kind of need a certain amount of knowledge in order to make a good prediction. And, you can substitute models or data. And as long as you pour enough knowledge in, you can get to the level that you get a good enough prediction. But, If you don't have models, you need more data. And if you just have physical models, if you're just doing physical modeling, well, then your model has to be very good in order to get a good prediction, right? And it's really by letting the two compensate for each other, we can do better than either discipline on its own. And so one of the ways that we've been looking at scientific machine learning, there's multiple ways, and one of the ways we've been doing it is with the universal differential equations. So the general idea here is that you can, instead of trying to define a mechanistic model completely, you can leave your mechanistic model to have open, non-explained portions, and you can automatically learn those portions on the fly. So here, for example, this is an ecological model, the Lotka-Volterra equation. So a lot of people might know the Lotka-Volterra equation, but what if you didn't know it, right? You might sit down and say, well, I know mechanistically that if I leave rabbits alone, they will explode in population, right? They'll just get exponential growth. And so you might just say x prime equals alpha x. Rabbits have exponential growth. And wolves, well, if they don't have any food, then they die off. So they exponentially die off. So this is a mechanistic model, but it doesn't understand anything about how rabbits and wolves relate to each other. And so what we can do is you can say, let's stick a neural network right here, and let's learn how the rabbits and wolves relate to each other. And this is the universal differential equation approach, right? We're not saying, let's try to have a neural network learn everything. Let's have a neural network learn, every single detail about the system. Instead, what we're saying is we know a lot about the system. It's described by a differential equation. There's some prior knowledge that we have in here. Just this little piece we don't know about. What is the interaction? And if we do it like this, we can use very small amounts of data and just say, well, here's the number of rabbits, here's the number of wolves, and then tell me what happens in the future. And it's able to extrapolate accurately, which is a property that you don't generally have in machine learning, right? In machine learning, you can't generally extrapolate beyond your data set. And here, it really is able to do that in a principled and efficient way because there's so much other prior knowledge involved in the system. Right. So this methodology kind of is, you can build a model. You can, either a physical model or a biological model, chemical model. You can build this model with all of the knowledge that you have. But you can use neural networks within the model to be able to capture missing mechanisms. If you don't know how to model the higher order friction terms off your airplane, you can have the neural network correspond to the friction terms, but still model the whole airplane. And then what you can do is you can use this to be able to identify what your missing physical terms are, and then use that to be able to, once you've learned that neural network, it's actually telling you something about the physics that you're missing, right? So you can pull that out and you can start to ask questions like, is what it learned actually scientifically plausible, right? If it finds a relationship between rabbits and wolves, are the wolves eating the rabbits or the rabbits eating the wolves, right? You can start to ask these questions about what the neural network trained, and this gives you something that's scientifically verifiable. It's not just a black box neural network anymore because it's actually associated with the mechanisms in the model. And then you can use this, and then what you actually get out of it too is something that is more data efficient. It's able to just perform better than the original machine learning. And this lets us then use all of our modeling techniques with machine learning instead of having them live in two different silos. And so we can extend this in many different ways. So here, for example, is a probabilistic version of it, where we can start to say, well, we know parts of the model. What is the probability of having a missing term that, of missing a quadratic term in our model? And here, this Bayesian neural OD paper has an example where we can say, well, in 100% of the time, if we train a neural network and turn it into symbolic equations, that symbolic equation is a quadratic equation. So our original model was actually missing something that was quadratic. Right. So this kind of solves a lot of these issues. If you've been learning about mathematical modeling, where your question might be, well, how do you know if you have the right mathematical model? How do you quantify whether you have the right mathematical model? Well, this is a kind of a form to be able to say, if you write down your model and try to learn what's missing from it, this is a way to try to, in a principled way, try to quantify and solve that problem. And there's a lot of interesting things that come out of this as well. So, in the field of mathematical modeling, there are things like differential algebraic equations. And a differential algebraic equation lets you specify a conservation law on the evolution of a differential system. So you can say, here I have a chemical reaction network, but the amount of I have a chemical going from from version 1 to version 2 to version 3, but I should always have 100% of my chemical, right? It has 3 states, but I should always have 100% of it. This is a differential algebraic equation system, and so you can now start to say, well, let me actually build machine learning frameworks that require these conservation laws to be held as well. Now, how can you do that? Well, you can stick neural networks within such a model, and now you have a model where it's saying, learn the neural network such that the system is evolving, such that this arbitrary conservation law is preserved, right? And so you can start to say, like, I have to have conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, conservation of angular momentum. Whatever the neural network learns, no matter what, my actual model will satisfy the physical principles that I want it to. And this means that it's always, so you're using smaller black boxes in order to make sure that what you're learning in the end is truly interpretable and actually truly giving you something physical. And there's many other ways to do this as well. So for example, you can also encode this information directly within the neural networks itself. So this is a slide actually from one of my collaborators at CMU, where what you can do is you can start to say, let's have a neural network where it's based off of a graph neural network, but this graph should match the chemical properties of some chemical that we're trying to model, right? So, if you're to do molecular dynamics and you're looking at this, at one of these chemicals, you can say, well, the connection should kind of look like this, right? I have my oxygens and they connect to these other pieces, right? So here's the connectivity form that we should have. And the idea is that if we choose a neural network that has connection structures that are similar to the molecules, it should be able to be more efficient at giving you predictions like the molecules would act. And this is actually something that's been verified now, that you can get like 2 to 5 times more data efficiency, as in you can get better predictions with less data by encoding the chemical structures within the neural network systems. And you can also do this at a higher level and just talk about symmetries, right? So there are things like equivariant neural networks where you can start to say, well, my model, my model itself needs to be satisfying things like, it needs to be rotationally, it has to have rotational invariance or translational invariance, right? So if you're to rotate this molecule, 360 degrees, you should get back to the same thing, right? And so if your neural network doesn't satisfy those properties, then it might be giving you something that's a non-physical prediction, right? And so what you can do is you can start to choose neural networks that satisfy similar symmetry properties to what you're trying to predict. And this actually makes it so that way it can learn from a lot less data, right? Because if you're actually training a neural network, a standard neural network, the first thing it will try to do is it goes, oh, maybe I need to, I think I need to have these symmetries correct, right? So the general idea here is that, instead of making it so that way your first big chunk of data is teaching the neural network Newton's laws and the fact that energy has to be preserved, you can just tell it, Newton's laws and that energy has to be preserved. And then you have much more data that is able to be used for the more non-trivial things that you really want to be learning. Right, so that's just a general outline of scientific machine learning and how it's used throughout scientific disciplines. Let me dive into a few examples here about how we're making use of it in battery modeling and climate modeling. So, well, this is a project with CMU where essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to use these scientific machine learning tools to do closed loop optimization of batteries for battery powered aircraft or more generally better batteries, right? And the way that we're doing this is, well, there's something called a DFT, which is density functional theory, which is used to give you a lot of properties about a molecule. And from these properties of the molecule, you can derive these differential algebraic equations, which are known as microkinetic models that tell you a lot of the properties of the battery. You can then take these and you put them into what's called the pseudo 2D model to really get like these refined measurements of how will the battery degrade over time. So you can do all of this in theory. If you had enough compute power, you can model everything, every single molecule, all the way to the battery, and then that'll tell you whether the material that you made is a good source for the battery, right? But in practice, that is way too large of a scale to really be able to automate the materials discovery process. So what we could do is we can say, well, instead of having to run a full DFT simulator, instead of having to do a full chemical simulation, we can train the graph convolutional neural network to have the same properties as our molecular simulation. So that way we can just ask that neural network, what should the properties of the material be the material be? What is this reactivity against this other molecule? And it can spit out correct answers. Right. So essentially here, our chemical simulator is an infinite data source that we then train this neural network against to then be able to get really fast predictions on what the actual molecular properties would be. And we do that to the differential algebraic equations of the microkinetic model as well, and of the partial differential equations here. And suddenly we have a system that is very quickly just asking 3 neural networks what they think the best prediction is. And you can then start to put in, well, here's my material. How much degradation in the battery do I get? And it runs through, and it just directly tells you, here's how good your battery is. You go back to your materials, and this lets you then really quickly iterate through materials and find out which material you should be trying to build, and then go build it in the lab and make a better battery, right? So this is really like bringing it so that way, in theory, you could do all this today if you had, 3 years to run these calculations, but now you can iterate through this process in minutes or hours, and then get this to tell you what materials you should be actually making. And not only that, but because we have these neural networks involved, they don't have to just be learning from our models. They can also learn from the data, right? Because every single time we synthesize a new material, we actually get a new measurement on how good the battery actually is. And then we can actually train this back into the system. So this system can end up learning to be a better predictor than our actual models were in the first place. This is something that we've been investigating in a simplified form in what's known as self-fit. So some of my collaborators tried this on a simplified form, and they actually saw that they can get a model that was 19% better at predicting the degradation over time, better than the state-of-the-art models. So even if you have everything that you think is all the physics, right, you're still missing some things, right? Because as batteries get hotter, you have heat dissipation and all that. And so what this actually learns to do is it learns to be a faster model that also predicts better than the true mathematical equations, because they aren't the true mathematical equations. They're missing a lot of the higher order physics that can occur. So another case of this is we wanted to add very high fidelity ocean models to climate models, right? So here, for example, is a 3D simulation of an ocean column. Now, we can't really put this inside of a real climate model because a 3D simulation is extremely expensive. So how can we learn what a very good small model is to put it into our ocean, into our climate model that kind of captures the ocean but isn't the full ocean simulator? So what we can do is we can say, so what people do today is they do a lot of analytical kind of computations. So you can take an integral along the x, y, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to go through all the details of that, but what you end up with is a one-dimensional partial differential equation that, if you were to solve it with the correct parameterization, then it would give you similar behaviors to that full 3D ocean model. If you took out that neural network, that's what people would be doing today, where this term right here is called the convective adjustment. And in the ocean literature, you'd hear all about, how to do these parameterizations. And there's a lot of study about, what is the correct way to encode physics in this simplified model. But all of them are all simplifications, so they're all incorrect. So what we did here was we said, well, let's take one of these simplified models as our source, right? Because it already gets a lot of the physics correct. It doesn't get all of it correct, but it gets a lot of it correct. And let's add a neural network to the part where we kind of know that there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So the convective adjustment is saying, well, the heat column, right? The heat that's going down from the top, heat kind of moves linearly through the ocean almost. And so the convective adjustment is just saying that one property right there. Heat almost kind of moves linearly down through the water, but there's also a lot of other stuff going on, right? So let's have all that information in there, and let's let the neural network learn that other stuff, right? And now you can make this be a simple machine learning problem, right? So there's a heat flux that we're missing, so we can take our heat flux measurements and put a loss against them. But this only does okay. So this version of the model only is okay, and the reason is because what we really need to be doing is we don't want to get the derivative correct, right? This is like the derivative, and the neural network is specifying the derivative of the model. And if you're in an engineering course, you've probably heard that getting the derivative correct is not good for getting, for controlling a system well. What you need to do is you need to make sure you get the integral correct, right? And so if we move our loss from being about the neural network itself, but instead to being, well, let's solve the model. So let's solve the partial differential equation and put our loss function on the solution of the partial differential equation. Then we're doing integral control, which we know from good engineering principles just gives you better results. And that's what ends up happening here. And so what we end up getting here is that this version of a simplified, of the simplified ocean column is very good at predicting what the temperature will be along the height of the ocean. It's actually the best model that we found for it. So it's better than any of these ones that people have derived analytically. Because it uses all that analytical information with a neural network in there. And it also does better than just using the neural network on its own, right? It's really using both of the tools together to be able to give you a very fast but very high fidelity simulation of what will happen to the ocean temperature in the z-axis. Now, this does raise a question that I kind of glossed over before, right? We have a neural network, but we're not training the neural network on its own. So this is not a training problem like you do with just standard PyTorch or TensorFlow. This is a neural network inside of a whole ocean model or a whole climate model that you're then training within the context of the climate model, right? Your training data is the results of running the model itself. So how do you actually fit a neural network within inside of a simulator? Right, that's a question that we can't just gloss over anymore. So it turns out this comes from adjoint equations. So adjoint equations are, what inside of like the computational science field, it's basically what you'd have as the backpropagation for calculating the derivative of continuous equation solvers. And so, for example, there's a formulation of the adjoint, which is given in the neural ordinary differential equation paper, which basically says you can solve forwards and then you can solve backwards. And if you do this in the right way, you get the derivative back out. Sounds nice, right? You just have to run your simulation forwards, then you have to run your simulation backwards, and you're done, right? Turns out that it's not that easy, right? So if you actually take this adjoint that is described, in the neural ordinary differential equations paper, made for machine learning purposes, it will actually fail on a lot of engineering examples. Let's actually pull out one example. If we want to go into more detail, you can ask me questions about this. We can actually prove on a very small case that no matter what tolerance you choose, and no matter what no matter what you choose, it is completely unconditionally unstable on some problems. So one problem is the advection equation. An advection equation is just a wave moving forwards. And the way to think about it is, if this du dt equals a du dx, you have to differentiate. You have to, when you're solving PDEs, you have to kind of tell it, how you're going to change a derivative into a discrete operator, right? So you can do forwards minus backwards divided by delta x, or you can do backwards minus forwards divided by delta x. Now, if you're solving the advection equation, it's only moving in one direction. And so where you're getting your information from better be what's behind you, right? Because your future value is going to have to come from the value behind you. So it turns out that, even though the first derivative can be defined as forward minus backwards, or forwards minus here divided by delta x, or it can be defined as, backwards minus here divided by delta x, only one of those is actually a stable way to solve this partial differential equation, right? So both are mathematically correct, but only one is numerically correct, because the other one will give you this unconditional instability and will diverge to infinity for no matter what delta t or delta x you choose. And so this is an example then of where the adjoint is going to fail, because if you solve it forwards in a way that's stable, then your data is coming from behind you. Then when you reverse the equation, your data is coming from the other direction. And so whatever ODE you wrote down, it didn't matter which one you chose, one of those two ODEs is incorrect and will go to infinity. So I mean, so that is probably a very quick explanation of what's a kind of a deeper mathematical problem. But what I really want to highlight here is that you can't just use a tool built for machine learning on these engineering problems, because you can find some very clear, numerical issues that will arise. And so you really have to work through some numerical problems. And there's really one way to really highlight what these numerical problems are. A lot of them come down to this problem, which we call stiffness, right? And one way to think about it is, let's say you have a linear ODE. If you saw, so you have one of these linear ODEs that's like u prime equals minus lambda u, right? So let's say you solve it with u prime equals minus lambda u going forwards, right? Now mathematically, if you reverse it by saying u prime equals lambda u, you mathematically get back to the same place, right? You can, inside your ordinary differential equation class for an undergraduate, you might even prove that going forwards with this is equivalent to going backwards with this, right? Those two ODEs are exactly the same. But if you put that into a numerical ODE solver, what you see is they're not the same when lambda is big. And the reason is because when in the direction that you're exponentially growing, your errors are going to be exponentially growing. And so if that exponential is really big, then your errors are going to grow really fast. So for example, here I'm saying like, oh, blue is the lambda equals 30. It goes down and it goes back up on the same line. Orange is lambda equals 40. It goes down and it's supposed to go back up on the same orange line, but it doesn't. And when you're at lambda equals 50, it's really far off. And so this means that this idea of how fast things are moving actually it will be a problem for how we're calculating derivatives and all that, right? If we want to fit neural networks within scientific models, we have to be very careful about the tools we choose and make sure they're not prone to errors on this type of problem, because the standard things that you see, even at a place like NeurIPS, have this problem. So just a quick recap for where we are. I explained a little bit about what scientific machine learning is, and I showed how we're using it to improve batteries and climate models. But we have to be very careful about it, right? Because there's kind of this stiffness problem that can show up. So I kind of want to do a little bit of a discussion of what is stiffness and why do we need to care about it, and how does that impact the tools that we have to create. So what is stiffness? Why is this a behavior that you should be really worried about? And how could you kind of think about when your system will have the problem, right? So it really comes from multi-scale behavior. So kind of think about this line, right? In general, you want to say that y of t is just doing something pretty simple, right? It's just going up and it's flattening out. In reality, it's bumping around at a very smaller scale, right? And so if you'd ask it, what is the derivative at this time point? You kind of want to say it's almost zero, right? Because it's shallowing out. But in reality, its derivative is almost infinity because it's moving up really fast. It's just there's a lot of small scale bumps that are going up and down that average out to be essentially zero. But at any given time point, a lot of things are changing. And this is a problem with multi-scale behavior, right? So if you think about something like a biological system, you have a ton of chemical reactions changing the amount of a given concentration in your body at a very rapid rate. Things are connecting and disconnecting at a rate of one millisecond or 1 microsecond at a time. But if you then want to ask how your circadian rhythm or how certain metabolic concentrations are changing over time, they have one small scale, which is every small little interaction, and then there's a large scale of, oh, if you haven't eaten in a few hours, it's eventually going to go to the steady state. And so those two different time scales together is really what gives you this problem. Because if you think about things like Euler's method and simple methods for extrapolating derivatives, well, the easy thing to say is you say, well, if I know my current derivative and I know where I am, I just move forward by the here's my position, here's my velocity. I move forward by the velocity over delta t, and so this is where I predict I will be. That prediction is completely incorrect on a stiff system because you haven't factored in the fact that your derivative will be decreasing a lot and then increasing and then decreasing, right? It needs to somehow average over the future. And so stiff equations, you can also just think about them as it's where explicit methods don't work. It's where a lot of your simple ideas for how to do something break down. But this is interesting though, right? Because just having multi-scale behavior is something that shows up in all of the engineering and scientific systems that we're interested in, right? If you have something like a convective flow, right? You have you have like a heater system, right? The heat is so let's say we're talking about your stovetop, right? The electronics of your stovetop are almost instant. It's almost instantly turning on the heat of your stove. It's just the heat that's flowing out to your out of the stove and out through your room. Well, it might take how long does it take to turn your stove on to then heat up your entire room? Right, that might take a whole day, even though it takes only seconds for your stovetop to turn on. Right, so if you want to model this kind of system, that will have this kind of multi-scale behavior. And another case that always tends to have multi-scale behavior are chemical reaction systems, right? Because catalyzed reactions take on the order of microseconds, whereas uncatalyzed reactions might only have one reaction every few minutes or every few hours. And so and so you really have to be careful of this effect whenever you're dealing with anything that comes from chemistry or anything that comes from combustion models or things like that. Or anything from biology, right? Because you have very quick things happening at the cell level, which is then slower at the whole tissue level, which is then aggregating to do something at the whole organ. But that's your organ is not making changes every millisecond, while your cells are responding to their environment in milliseconds, right? So you really need to, if you're trying to get an accurate model of a pharmacometric system, like of how a drug is impacting the body, you will have these huge timescales, and unless your system can handle that, you will just get incorrect or bad predictions. And another case which really shows up is robotics, right? It's kind of you might not think about robotics as having multi-scale properties, but robotics actually have this property where they're rigid body systems, right? So I defined earlier, these differential algebraic equations, which enforce these conservation laws in the evolution. It turns out that conservation laws, you can instead think about them as infinite stiffness, right? Because you're basically saying, well, infinitely fast, you're going to go back to the submanifold where energy is conserved, right? If you relax that to be kind of slower, where you can say, well, you can slowly move to have higher energy, that slow movement would be the stiffness. And so when we enforce that you have to be on a certain constraint, then you always will have this kind of stiffness. And so robotic systems are one that really tends to see this in this other light. So I mean, this is telling us that stiffness is kind of everywhere, right? If you build a robot, or if there's heat involved, or chemicals, or biology, or physics, like if you do anything, there's stiffness involved. So maybe not in something like predicting what movie someone will watch, right? The Netflix problem or the Amazon problem might not have stiffness, but engineering and science do. And so what we've been looking at is, well, what do we have to do to change our machine learning systems so that way when we stick neural networks inside of systems, we're able to make it work effectively. And so what we've been working on is, we've been able to show that, traditional tools or even tools in things like Python, if you're to put these stiff systems and put neural networks in them, they fail to actually be able to learn anything effective. And so you need to really change your training technique to actually make it work out. And there's a lot more details in that I'm not going to go into, but it really is a difference of doesn't work to work, which requires this kind of rebuilding of the system in a way that is numerically viable for these kinds of issues. So let me kind of do a case study here a little bit. So let's say there is a stiff system that you really care about. So the one that we're thinking of is like a heating model, right? So we want to model an air conditioning, which has these multi-scale effects, and we want to make sure that we want to be able to run it faster. And so we want to do this something similar to what we did with the climate models, where you say, let's train some kind of neural network thing to be the same thing as our air conditioning. So that way we can just ask the neural network what the air conditioning will do, right? So the first idea is, well, if it's supposed to be some kind of time series, what you'll learn in Machine Learning 101 is that recurrent neural networks do time series stuff. So let's say you try a recurrent neural network on that. And let's say you try a recurrent neural network on a system that looks like what's on the left here, right? Well, recurrent neural network first of all, it wants to have uniform time steps, right? It's moving by a delta t in time. Well, how are you going to ever choose one delta t such that you capture this spike, right? You need to make sure that your delta t is super, super small here, so that way you can go down and go up. But if your delta t is super, super small, then you need, what, 1 million, 10 million, 100 million layers just to be able to capture the system. That it's kind of ridiculous, right? So recurrent neural network can't work here because you can't deal with uniform time steps. But also, this is essentially one of these explicit methods, right? Is looking at where you are and then projecting to the future where it thinks you should be. That's exactly the same problem as looking where you are and projecting to where you will be in the future. So in two ways, right? In one way, it's just unstable and not going to give you good predictions. But in the other way, it would require you to have such a small time step if you want to have uniform time stepping, that it's just not a viable way to handle this type of problem, right? So how can we get around this? So what we've been doing is we've been developing kind of new architectures which are able to handle these types of engineering systems, right? So it's not, at this point, it's not just, you take a standard neural network and put it into your engineering system. You need to use new neural networks that are robust to these types of engineering problems. So, for example, this is a quick demo of the continuous time echo state network. It's a bit in depth, so I'm not going to give all the details here. But essentially, you can take and fix a non-stiff ordinary differential equation, and then you can implicitly find what the projector is from that small ODE to your original ODE. And so now, once you've found a way to do a projection, then you can always just do simulations of the simpler ODE. And then if you just know how to project it, you look at the small ODE through the right lens, then you get the same result. Then you understand what the result of the big ODE is, right? So you just have to figure out what's that lens, right? How are you supposed to look at the small ODE to get the big ODE? And that's the difficulties of doing the SVD factorization that's in the paper. But the general idea is there, right? That we now have a continuous system, and we can look at it at any point in time. And that should, in theory, tell us how the original system is working. And this is a way that really works around these issues with stiffness, because our prediction system is not explicit anymore, right? Where we're actually using all of time together to be able to do this factorization approach and handle this training in a way that doesn't blow up to infinity, but also, we have a whole ordinary differential equation that is our underlying system, and so it's actually something that's continuous in time. So we don't have that issue of where should we be taking the data. And so here's actually an example on a chemical reaction system where if we use things like physics-informed neural networks, like a standard neural network with some physical knowledge in it, or if we use just a standard echo state network, which is like a better version of a recurrent neural network, all of these things from machine learning tend to fail. And it's really just this new architecture that is able to handle these really rapid changes, because it's really been designed to be able to do that. And so this is really the kind of architecture that we're taking and applying to real engineering systems. And this is actually a very interesting approach, because when we apply it to things like a heating system, we can build these surrogate models that are 100 times faster to simulate, that give almost exactly the same results. And so one of the ways that we're using this type of architecture is in building models for more efficient buildings. So about 40% of energy use actually comes from buildings. So cars and automobiles only are 17%. Well, if you do well in buildings, you're going to save a lot more energy than everyone moving to electrical vehicles ever would, right? So we've been looking at this problem. And the main issue here is, well, an air conditioning modeling itself, right? Like the air conditioning is a very difficult object. And what you want to do is you want to take 10 air conditionings and stick them in a bunch of buildings, and you want to say, is this building design, is that energy efficient? Or if I change something about the building design, is that more energy efficient? So you need to run this model, thousands and thousands of times with different building configurations to find what is the most energy efficient building. So what we've done is we made it so that way you can surrogatize these air conditionings and make it so that way you get a faster version. And then once you've trained it once, you can reuse that faster version in all of the different buildings to really quickly and rapidly figure out what is the most energy efficient building. And what we've been able to do is basically show that, if you just do the pure Julia simulation, we're already about 6 times faster than some of the state-of-the-art tools in this field, like Dymola for Modelica, or things like MATLAB and Simulink. But then if you apply the surrogатization process, right, where you transform something to a machine learning piece, and you stick this machine learning piece within your building model, then we get up to 60 and 600 times faster than your original modeling source. Right, like this is really saying that a building that took you a year before to be able to get an accurate simulation of how energy efficient it is, now it's less than a day. So you might as well iterate through many different building designs, right? And so this is how scientific machine learning is really impacting the engineer. So that kind of gives you a taste of of not just the problems that we're solving, like battery engineering and building engineering and climate modeling, but also that there's some numerical details. And so you can't just use previous systems. You have to really have new tools made in order to make scientific machine learning work. So what are these tools that we're using, and what are the tools that you should be using if you're interested in doing machine learning more efficiently? This is what we have the Julia SciML ecosystem for. So this is an open source software organization. You can find a lot of more details at SciML.ai, but there's a whole bunch of libraries in there. There's 50 libraries I can't even fit on the screen. But what the general purpose of this is to democratize scientific machine learning and build the next generation of machine learning tools, right? So the machine learning of this next generation has differential equations involved. It has chemical reactions involved. It has molecular dynamics and astrophysics involved. So we're building a whole set of tools so that way machine learning can compose with all of these types of biological and physical models. So that way scientific machine learning can be done by your average everyday person who isn't ready to build a library, right? You should just be able to load it up and do scientific machine learning the same way that you can do, a TensorFlow on a recurrent neural network today. And so what is actually in this this package ecosystem? Well, the very foundation of it is, physical models are written as differential equations, and so we made sure to build very fast differential equation solvers. So this is DifferentialEquations.jl. It generally gets about 50 times faster than SciPy, 50 times faster than MATLAB, and about 100 times faster than RSDEsolve. And so, there's a bunch of different benchmarks that I could show on it, where I can say, well, if you have a non-stiff equation, we're about, here's how much faster we are. If you look at, and this is faster in terms of work precision. So the way, if you want to dig through our SciML benchmarks, what you're really looking at is, here is the error that you actually got in the simulation. Here's the amount of time to get that error. What is the fastest solver to be able to hit this time? What is the fastest solver that's able to solve this model to the error that you care about? And it turns out that if you look at what's on the bottom here, right, these methods are solving to the same error as these other methods, but just doing it faster. All of these methods are these pure Julia methods, only in DifferentialEquations.jl. And in many cases, you're seeing orders of magnitude performance difference, even against things like CVOD Atoms, which is a C++ code, or things like LSODA, which is this Fortran code, right? So this is something that's really optimized, even when you're looking at things against C and Fortran, because it's really using the core tools of Julia to accelerate it to its utmost extent. And it's not just on these non-stiff equations, right? The simple ones, but it's also true on the hardest equations, which are the stiff models, right? Because this is really what we care about. This is what every engineering system is. And so we're talking about, half an order of magnitude or order of magnitude performance increase over even things like the classic C++ and Fortran libraries for handling stiff dynamical systems. And then we also have a lot of these tools throughout Julia, which really bring it so that way you can more easily go to the domain. So here, for example, is Reaction Mechanism Simulator that I've been working with a PhD student here at MIT. And it lets you really quickly simulate and analyze chemical kinetic systems, like from combustion models. And if you look at it against something like Cantera or these commercial software, you see that it's outperforming it. Not only does it outperform it, but it's also something that's compatible with scientific machine learning. You can stick neural networks in there, and you can make it automatically learn what chemical reaction systems you're missing, or what chemical reactions did you not know about that need to be true in order to be able to fit the data. Right. So this is the reaction mechanism simulator that kind of builds on top of these differential equation solvers. And other ways we're looking at making use of these differential equation solvers. So, for example, PyBAM is an organization that's building these battery models in Python. What they're looking at developing right now is they're using the Julia differential equation solvers to improve their battery models, right? So they're actually setting it up so behind the scenes it's actually using Julia for a lot of the computations. And so the real key here is that the process is essentially fully automated for using it with neural networks. If you write down a code where it's like, this is my differential equation, this is my neural network, I just stick the neural network in the differential equation, and then I tell it to fit it using the fit functions in a machine learning or neural network library. All of those details that I discussed about, handling the stiffness in a way that doesn't diverge, all of that happens behind the scenes automatically, right? It actually does a code rewrite for you. It looks at the code that you have, and at compile time, it completely rewrites this other version that does this gradient calculation in a way that is going to be stable for your problem. So the nice thing about this whole ecosystem then is there is a lot of details underneath it. But you don't need to necessarily worry about that because all of those are handled automatically for you as the user. And it's built in such a way that we can continue to build out new astrodynamical simulators and everything like that, where what the person who's actually using the simulators never has to think about how to make this work or how to make it stable. They really just have to think about what is my model and what are the things in the model that I don't know. There's also a lot of interesting mathematical details that I kind of don't want to go into too much detail here. But for example, within the adjoint equations, there is something called a vector Jacobian product that has to be calculated. And so if you look at these Fortran or C codes that we've been doing adjoint equations in climate models for years, they're doing this in a way that is O of n, that requires that you calculate this Jacobian and then do a transpose and multiply. But since we actually have a fully differentiable programming language, we can improve the actual these calculations over what can be done in C and Fortran. So here, for example, we can use the vector Jacobian product tools of a backpropagation library like zygote.jl to do a better, more efficient calculation of this term. Right? It's kind of a detail, but what that really means is that these Julia libraries, by integrating very strongly with these reverse mode automatic differentiation tools and these machine learning tools, it actually improves the differential equation solver libraries themselves. And so what you get at the end of the day is something where you can say, well, there's so many different issues that you can have to think about in terms of, what is the most efficient way to calculate something and what is the most stable way to calculate something. And we just have ways to be able to tell the code generation tool, yeah, here's the one that I want to use. So you have all the different options, and you just kind of, it will choose one for you. If you don't know what you're doing, you can just let it choose a code generation method for you for how to calculate these derivatives. But if you want to optimize it a bit, also all of the choices are available there. And that's really something that's new to these systems, right? Because, for example, if you look at something like torch, diffeq, or JAX, right? These are some methods for neural ODEs built on machine learning libraries. They don't have the ways to be able to handle stiffness. They don't have all these different ways to be able to, handle these kinds of scientific or engineering models because they weren't built for that purpose, right? They were built for machine learning models. And, so if you go, well, something has to have done a little bit of this before, right? If you go to something like PET-C or Sundial, some of these classic engineering programs, they are able to do, stable derivative calculations or stable adjoints, but they don't have that machine learning integration to accelerate those pieces. And so it's really just the Julia SciML ecosystem that is able to handle these difficult engineering systems, but in a way that incorporates all the machine learning tools to make it both automatic and the highest performance. And you see this then when we look at a bunch of these examples. So, I took a bunch of equations from astrodynamics, chemical kinetics, numerical weather prediction, and I ran a bunch of timings against something like torch diffie-q, right? Because torch diffie-q is a library that does neural ODEs. Is it good enough to be able to handle these types of scientific models? So we stuck some scientific models in there, and we showed that DifferentialEquations.jl is about 30 times to 7,600 times faster than this other library for handling these types of scientific problems. In fact, there's such a performance difference that if you take the spiral neural ODE from the neural ODE paper, and it actually optimizes the neural, it actually solves the whole optimization, the training problem of the neural ODE in the Julia tools faster than a forward pass of the neural network in torch diffie-q. So this really changes the types of problems that you can solve, right? But making it so that way it is stiff and able to handle stiff equations and super fast and able to handle the machine learning integration really changes the types of problems that you can look at. Because now you can start to say, well, I have this huge building. Let me figure out how I need to, let me try 1,000 different building designs to find the one that is the most efficient. And so in conclusion, what we've really done here, and what we're still doing with this Julia SciML ecosystem, is we're bridging computational science and machine learning to really improve all aspects of discovery. I didn't talk about all the applications, but some other ones that I'm involved with are, for example, faster drug development, which is using these models of the human body and its drug interactions to be able to more quickly develop these drugs. We're building better batteries. We're building more energy efficient buildings, better climate models, better predictions of agriculture, predictions of where locusts will be in the future. All of these things are built on top of what's now a stack that is using data plus physical knowledge to be able to improve the predictions and accelerate the ability to do such predictions. So thank you very much. I hope that this is very enlightening. And if you're interested in scientific machine learning or working with us on these kinds of tools, we're always looking for more developers to our open source ecosystem. So please get in touch with us if you're interested in that. I think now is a good time to start fielding the questions.
Yes, sir. We have few questions for you, sir, from our audience. So the first question is from Indrani Singh. How can college students contribute to Julia community?
Yeah, so contributing to the Julia community is actually fairly easy, right? Because if you learn the Julia programming language, then all of the packages are written in Julia itself. So for example, let's say you've learned something about differential equation solving, you can go to ordinary diffie-q.jl. And if you want to know how are these differential equation solvers built, if you click on the source, it's just Julia code, right? So once you've learned the language, then you actually know how to work on all the libraries. There's no difference from using the language and building library code. That's very different from something like Python or R, right? Because if you look at something like TensorFlow is actually written in C++. And so if you want to work on TensorFlow, you have to use a different language than you're actually going to be using it with, right? That's not the case here. So if you want to contribute to the Julia community, start working with the Julia language and start getting involved with the community by going to the community resources. So for example, there is the Julia Lang organization, and on here there's a community tab. And this shows how to get to some of the most common channels. So one channel is the discourse, which is a question and answering system for a lot of these Julia problems. So if you're trying to learn Julia, this is a good place to ask questions. Or if you want to get in a chat with someone to really get some more one-on-one, you can also join the Julia Slack, right? So there's a Slack and a Zulip channel. And this Slack is fairly active. So right now you can see that there's someone asking me questions about how do I solve this kind of differential equation. If you ask me a question, I can help you get involved, help you learn how to use the differential equation solvers, and if you want to get involved in developing the SciML stack, I can help you get involved and figure out what matches your interest and help you get started with this. I guess one last resource that I would point to is if you go to YouTube, there's a lot of great stuff on the Julia Programming Languages YouTube channel, right? One thing that can be very helpful is developing Julia packages. So I made this video about a year ago, which goes through all about how do you develop a Julia package. How do you get it online with continuous integration services and registered in such a way that when someone says add my package, it downloads your package and runs it. Right. So this whole video goes through all those details. But yeah, definitely trying to just read something is probably not the best way to do it. I would definitely say if you want to get involved in the community, join our chats and we'll start talking with you and we'll be excited to have you on board.
So our next question is from Rishika Raj. She is asking, would you like to tell us about GSOC?
Oh yeah, so GSOC is Google Summer of Code. So every year there's this program that is run where students get involved with the SciML organization or the Julia Lang organization. There's actually two full organizations now where you get involved with writing code and you contribute to these open source libraries, and you're actually paid to do this. So it's a paid development position over the summer to work on these open source projects. Now, the way you get involved is you get in touch with one of the contributors. So, if you're interested in something like differential equations or scientific machine learning, you'd send me a message saying like, hey, I'm interested in working on these things. And what we'll do is we'll generally have you do kind of like a trial period, right? Where you kind of do a few pull requests and really show that you know what you're doing. And then you do this application saying like, here's what I want to work on in the summer. I want to build out, neural networks in astrophysical simulators, and here's all, and we'll work with you to write that application, right? And that's why you should get in contact with us. We'll work with you and we'll help you find the right application, and then if it's accepted, then you're paid for the whole summer to work on that project. There's a lot of nice things that come from it, right? So with scientific machine learning and the Julia language, a lot of us are actually academics as well. So you can almost think about it as a starting research project, and getting to know some people who are faculty at other universities like MIT and Cambridge. It's just a very nice program for a student who wants to be really going forward in the school or graduate studies in this area.
Thank you, sir. That was a great answer. So the next question is from Shambhavi. It seems scientific machine learning contains a lot of topics from multiple domains. What would you suggest to some college students to start in scientific machine learning?
Yeah, it really depends on who you are, right? So some people work on methods, some people work on applications. If you're more interested in the applications, I would say as an undergraduate student, learn the application that you care about. Like learn climate modeling, learn climate modeling, or learn biological modeling. Learn a domain, but also start to learn some of the methods, and take a numerical analysis course. It definitely is something where you'll have to kind of grow into and kind of go to a PhD program in applied mathematics or numerical analysis to really kind of grow into someone who's really doing some of the top newest methods in scientific machine learning. But the way to get there is to start by just picking a problem by saying I'm really interested in chemical reaction networks. Let me learn chemical reaction networks, and let me learn now what people are doing in scientific machine learning of chemical reaction networks. And that's like a straight path to start doing that kind of research.
Thank you very much, sir. So our next question is from Ravi. She is asking, if someone has not higher level knowledge in applied mathematics, then can we contribute?
The next question is from Ravi. If someone has not higher level knowledge in applied mathematics, then can we contribute to SciML organization?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that could be done, right? So we do need people working on documentation and websites, and people helping with our community, and all sorts of different things. So yeah, there are a lot of ways to help out. If you're just interested in helping, get involved in our chat channels, and we can probably find things for you. In fact, one of the things we need a lot is just designers, right? How do we build good diagrams that really explain something to someone? Website designs and all these kinds of things. We need help in a lot of things that are not just applied mathematics. So it'd be great to have many people on board.
Thank you, sir. So our next question is from Ashwin. He's asking, does Julia have its own open source events?
Oh yeah, there's a whole lot of open source events. Actually, you can go to there is a events calendar that you can see, and here is just within a span of 2 weeks, there's machine calls with the machine learning group for how how the machine learning libraries are going to be built next, and all these talks about automatic differentiation, semi-social user group chats, and everything. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of open source events going all the time. This is if you go to the Julia Lang website, you go to community, this is where you'll find it.
Thank you, sir. Next question
Thank you,
is,
sir.
So I do need to make sure that I do take off here. I do have something at 9:30, which, but I could take this last question though.
Okay, sir. So our next question is stiffness only something we found to be a problem in the scientific machine learning domain, or can you see this affecting the entire domain of machine learning?
Yeah, I did not go into that paper, but we actually just got a result that showed that stiffness can actually show up in some machine learning problems, and we actually found a way where using knowledge of stiffness can improve and accelerate machine learning architectures. So it's not just something that it's something that's pervasive in all scientific problems, and so that's why we know so much about it. But it actually can improve machine learning itself, and so there's a paper we just put out on that, and so. I can share more details when it's really out there. Yeah, but yeah, so stiffness is actually something that's going to be probably crucial for like the next. I think the next decade of machine learning, you'll start to hear more about it. So yeah, so thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. So because of time constraints, we are not taking further questions. So if you have any question, then you can personally ask to him Julia Slack and discourse as well.
Yep.
So thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us with your knowledge. You have created a new spark in our society, and members are very happy to know that how can we do more predictive ML with less data. So thank you, sir. Hence, let's conclude today's session. So bye, everyone. And once again, thank you so much, sir.
Yep. Thank you very much.